we read in Luke 2 that there was a man named Simeon. It says that he was waiting for the Messiah to come. In verse 36, it says, he was righteous and devout and was eagerly awaiting for the Messiah to come and rescue Israel. And then we know from the story that Mary and Joseph bring the baby Jesus to Simeon, and he gives a blessing over him. And he says to God, "Sovereign Lord, now let your servant die in peace, as you have promised. I have seen your salvation." So even Simeon kind of joins the ranks in waiting. And just one more look. Luke 7, verses 18 through 19. This is an occurrence with John the Baptist and his disciples talking about who Jesus might be. John the Baptist's disciples told him about all these things, meaning what Jesus was doing. John the Baptist, calling two of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" So you guys are getting this with me? There's this expectation that's brewing, these prophecies that have been put forth, and they're wondering, is Jesus this one? We've been waiting for 400 years. Is Jesus the one? And that's what the celebration of Advent is all about. It's the two-pronged idea of looking back to how the Israelites waited for the first coming of our Messiah, and then it's us looking forward to the second coming of the Messiah. And that's what verses 7 through 11 really hit on. R.S. Thomas, a poet, says that the meaning is in the waiting. The meaning is in the waiting. So our lesson, what does this teach us? Maybe that waiting is not such a bad thing after all. We're not necessarily waiting on the circumstances, but we're waiting on the one who is to come. We're not waiting on the what, but we're waiting on the who. So what is practical faith according to James 5, verses 1 through 11? Practical faith could be practice waiting on God. Now we've looked how the Israelites did that, and we're going to look particularly now in verses 7 through 11 and see what we can learn from the poor and how they waited in their situation. The first thing that we can learn from verses 7 through 8 is placing hope in future waiting. And I'm going to unpack this a little bit for you. In verses 7 and 8, it uses the two ideas, the Lord's coming and the Lord's coming is near. And then we're given the example of the farmer. Verse 7b says, "See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and the spring rains." Now I know some of you guys probably did some more look into this, and in your book too, I think it talked about it a bit. But just to give you a little bit of context, in Palestine, the audience to which he is writing to, the farmer was particularly dependent upon the rain that came in the late autumn and the early spring. For the farmer who prepares a field, sows seed, and then waits for a crop to come is a very natural illustration of waiting, because he can do little to impact or affect the outcome. It must rain at the right time, but it's not dependent upon him. And so what James is telling us is that many Christians must patiently wait for the Lord's return as well. I was talking about this passage with my roommate, Jonna Lee Henderson. Some of you know who she is. She attends church here and works with the 56ers. Some of your kids may have been through her program. She is a farmer. She does almonds and peaches on her farm. And I was asking her for more perspective, because obviously I don't have a farm at all, I don't garden at all, and it's hard for me to really implant myself in the farming analogy when I'm not in it at all. And what she was telling me is actually this week in particular is when the government will decide how much water to allot the different farmers for this coming year. And so we know that it hasn't rained very much at all. There's been very, very few days of rain. And honestly, I don't think about it very often because it doesn't readily affect me. Usually I'm more happy because I don't get wet, and it's easier for me to commute places and to walk places. But obviously it really impacts those in the farming industry. And so if you get a lot of rain in any one particular year, the government can give you up to 100% of the usual water ratio that they give you. But obviously if that source is depleted, then it's much less. So there is fear in the kind of the farming community that they might just be giving 30%. And this week is the week that the government will kind of announce that decision that's to be made. And I was asking her, how do you deal with that? Because that really is, her livelihood, and a lot of people, a lot of workers are kind of dependent upon this and her decision making too. And Donnelly has such a strong faith in the Lord, and she was telling me about how kind of in the farming industry, what she has noticed is that there is this real, authentic, genuine faith that a lot of the farmers do have. She was at a convention recently, and she was saying how so many of them are talking about the Lord, and not just kind of in a frivolous, like, we know the Lord, or we go to church or whatever, but because they really are dependent upon him for the rains to come, or for it not to snow and freeze everything over, or for the winds and all these different elements that we don't really think of very often, but they are dependent upon the Lord. And so she always comes away from these conventions not just with new knowledge, but she's actually super encouraged in her faith because of the farming community. I thought that was really neat. I wouldn't have ever known that before. Commentator Moo speaks of every reference to early and late rains in the Old Testament occurs in the context affirming the faithfulness of the Lord. Let me say that again. Every reference to early and late rains in the Old Testament occurs in the context affirming the faithfulness of the Lord. There's Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Hosea, Joel, Zechariah, etc., these different references that he gives. That's really interesting to me, that whenever rains are talked about, partnered with that is an idea of faithfulness to the Lord. And he goes on to say, James's readers, being biblically literate, would have detected in the language of this verse about farmers an echo of the broader biblical theme, and thereby would be given a further reinforcement of confidence and of waiting for the Lord to act. Interesting. So the farmer must place his or her hope in the future for waiting for God's coming. In verse 7, James urges believers to be patient in view of the fact that the Lord is coming. In verse 8, James bases his exhortation to patience on the nearness of the Lord's coming. That's what verse 8 talks about, the nearness of the Lord. So what am I kind of trying to bring from this? That there's this future expectation and confident hope that we know of that the Lord is coming. And this is what the farmer is doing. That the farmer is dependent upon the Lord and waiting upon him. And we're given that analogy to have the same type of faith and trust that the Lord is coming. You don't know exactly when he's coming. You don't know exactly when the rain is coming. You don't know exactly how much it will be provided or things like that. You don't know all of the what and the when and the how, etc. But we do have this expectation, this confident expectation that the Lord is coming. And what will come when the Lord comes again? Restored bodies, renewed creation, beauty everywhere. No more decay, death, sickness, injury, broken relationships, addiction, loneliness, or depression. Revelation 21:5 says, "Behold, I make all things new." So I told you that the idea of practical faith, according to James 5, is practice waiting on God. And the first way that we can do it, as I said, is placing hope in future waiting. We see again how the farmer is placing that hope even in the future waiting of the rains. And we too can place our hope, as James talks about, in the future coming of the Lord. And what does that do to encourage us in our current trial? Where we are right now, all of us can say we are waiting in something right now that is difficult for us. Placing hope in the future of God's coming encourages us in our trial today, because we know that this sickness will not always be this way. We know that this broken relationship will not always be this way, that this pain will not always be this way. And you'll remember that we learned in a couple studies ago, your situation is not a forever situation. Your trial is not a forever trial. And that's the encouragement that we can get from the idea that the Lord is coming. So the second idea of how we can practice waiting on God, as you see on your paper, is persevering through present waiting. This is what verse 10 says. As an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And you see that right there? He says, take as an example the prophets. So we're not given a list of who these prophets are, but I think a great place to turn would be Hebrews 11. This is the great faith chapter where we see by faith this person did this, by faith this person did this. Let me just read from verse 32. And what more shall I say, says the author of Hebrews? I do not have time to tell about Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered